Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham. We're coming at you today nearly live from a very rainy Ottawa, Ontario. We're here actually at the National Arts Centre. We haven't been here in about a year to do a show, and we're excited to be back. And we're talking about a show that's set in Newfoundland during the Second World War, and it's about race and identity and different conceptions of humanity, and it's a really terrific show. It's called Oil and Water, and we're here with the playwright, Robert Chafe.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited that you're here, and because you're not here for the whole run of the show.
I'm not here for the whole run of the show. You know, the playwright very rarely gets to actually go on tour and have fun like the actors do. So I am just here for the install of the show and the opening night, and then I go back to Newfoundland and start working on other projects right away. So.
And so the show is, you said this is part of a tour. This is the last stop.
This is the last stop of our 2014 winter tour. We started in Halifax in February at the Neptune Theatre, and then we brought the show back home to St. John's to the Ellis View Hall, and then we took a little break, and then we went to the Grand Theatre, the beautiful Grand Theatre in London, Ontario, where we finished last week, and now we're here at the National Arts Centre, which is tremendously exciting.
Yeah, and there seems to be a bit of a buzz around the show.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
Locally, I mean, like people who I know. When I saw the show last night, and when I said I was going to see it, people were like, "Oh yeah, that sounds really good." Like so people are aware of it.
Oh, great, good.
So
that's nice. It's nice. It's really, it's excellent to be here, walking down Elgin Street and seeing the 20-foot tall poster on the side of the building is quite thrilling and terrifying. But I'm glad people know about it, and hopefully people will come.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good run. And so the show, we should explain before we really get into it. It's about Lanier Phillips.
That's right.
Who was the first black man in St. Lawrence, Newfoundland, and he survived a shipwreck during the Second World War. He was an American naval officer.
That's right.
So obviously a historical piece.
Yes. Did
you do a lot of research on Lanier Phillips and his story?
Yeah, I guess, to take it really far back for me, a lot of my work is based on, I guess, biographies and true Newfoundland history. At least in the last 10 or 15 years, that's been the case. I did a piece for a small company in Newfoundland, Theatre Newfoundland, Labrador, that premiered in 2002 called Tempting Providence. That did come to Ottawa a couple of times. It was at GCTC about 3 or 4 years ago, and played the NAC a number of years before that. And that piece kind of changed how I view my work. Previous to that, I was really creating original narrative. And that piece sparked in me, I guess, an interest in the process more than anything else. Initially, the process of researching history and finding a kind of organic and natural way into translating that history to theatre. So that's where it started, an interest in the process. But then very quickly, watching Tempting tour, as it's been touring for the last 10, 12 years, watching it tour, meeting audiences afterwards, meeting several of her family members that were directly connected to the story, my love for writing true stories really blossomed because there's a kind of human element that you actually get to meet. Like we do Oil and Water, family and friends of these characters that are represented on stage. And in some cases, the characters, people that are represented as characters themselves, come see the show. So the connection to the material is visceral and terrifying and hugely, hugely gratifying.
So are all the characters... So obviously Lanier Phillips is the central character here, but there's also sort of this parallel story of the people in Newfoundland.
Yes,
and
right.
we get to know them a little bit. Are they real characters as well? Or real people?
Every person on that stage, there's 10 characters in the show, they're all based on real people. Now, some of them are more true to those real people than others. For example, there's a character in the show who's Lanier's friend on the boat, another black officer on the boat, Henry Langston. And literally all I know about Henry Langston is his name. I knew that he was a person of color and that he was on the boat. And every other thing about him, from where he was born to how he handled what was happening on the boat was completely made up by me. And then you have someone like Lanier, who's, as the most kind of developed character in the show, is very, very true to the man, how he spoke and how he looked at the world. So, and every variation between those two extremes. But yeah, every character on that stage is based on a real person. And so far, 2 of those real people have seen the show. Lanier's daughter, Vanza, is represented in the show. She saw the show opening night in St. John's back in 2011. And Levi Pike, one of the Newfoundlanders, who just passed away last year, was one of the rescuers on that day. He's seen the show 2 or 3 times before he passed away.
And the response was...
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. I mean, I remember, when you get into the mix of creating a show like this and the lead up to creating a show like this, it's quite a busy and frenzied time. And so I remember when we were doing the invite list for opening night in St. John's, we of course invited Levi, because I had been down to St. Lawrence several times to interview him for the piece, and was so taken by his memories and his personality as he was recalling the events of that day that I actually created a character based on him. That wasn't the intent when I went down, but I was so taken by him, I created a character based on him. And it was only leading up to doing so I worked on this piece for 2 years, and it was only leading up to doing the invite list that Jill, my director, Jill Kiley, said, have you does Levi know that you called a character by his name, that there's a character kind of based on him? Because it's kind of based on him. And I said, I don't think I told him. Just horrible, right? It makes me sound like an awful person. So I called Levi and I said, Levi, you're coming to see the show next week. You should know that there's a character on stage named Levi Pike. He shares certain things with your history. He shares a lot of other parts of him that aren't you at all. But I just want you to know that. And he said, oh, okay. And if someone called me and said that, I'd be, I don't know how I'd feel. And Levi showed up opening night with, I think he called the next day and booked 10 more tickets. He showed up with all of his family, and he really, really embraced the show, and he really, really embraced his part of the show. Aspects of him that were true in the show, he really embraced, but he also fully understood and fully supported the parts of him that I fictionalized. So, and same with Vanza. She was incredibly supportive of the piece, which makes everything a lot easier, of course.
Now, in putting this together, if these are based on real people, how much, or what sort of research, what was your process like? Was it mostly interviews?
A combination of a bunch of things. Really early on, I contacted Lanier, which was a terrifying prospect in itself. When I had the idea to write the play, a friend of mine, I originally wanted to write a screenplay, and then I found that it was being done, that there was a writer in St. John's and a producer in St. John's that were well on their way to making a movie about this story. And so I abandoned that idea, and then a mutual friend of mine and the screenwriters got us together, because I didn't know her previously. Her name is Carrie McDonald, and she's one of the writers in Republic of Doyle right now. So a mutual friend got us together, and Carrie was the one that actually suggested that I look at it as a play, and who gave me Lanier's number and said, you should call him and talk to him about it. She said, he's great, he'll be open to it. And so I called Lanier. I was terrified. I sat on the number for about 3 months trying to build the courage to talk to this man. I was so not afraid of him, just I had so much respect for him and affection for him, even though I'd never met him, that it was an intimidating prospect to call him and talk to him. And when I finally did, he was really open to the idea, but he said because he had just signed an agreement for the life story rights for the film, that while he was completely open and willing to let me do the play, he said perhaps you should use library resources and not talk to me, because I don't want to infringe upon that contract. And I said, that's totally fine. And I said, I'll send you the script when it's done. And he said, no, it's okay, I'll come see it. So immediate trust. It was incredible. So I never got a chance to talk to Lanier about the story itself. But I was very, very lucky insofar as Carrie was really supportive of the project. She gave me a ton of research. We got together several times, and we talked through a lot of things in the story. She let me read drafts of her screenplay, and my take on the story is 180 degrees in the opposite direction than what she did. What she did was really great, but I did something very, very different. And we have a person on our board of directors of Artistic Fraud Newfoundland, Chris Brooks, who's kind of like the godfather of Newfoundland theatre. He started one of our major theatres down there in the 70s. And in the 80s, he moved into radio production. And so he does incredible radio documentaries. Has done them for CBC for years, but also NPR in the States. And he did a documentary for NPR on Lanier in 1998 and offered over immediately. He said, here's my transcripts, because he had done 3 days worth of interviews with Lanier. So I had that research in hand already. And then I went down and I interviewed, for the St. Lawrence stories, I interviewed 2 of the 3 remaining rescuers that were still alive at that point. There's only 1 left now. Levi Pike and John Kelly. Levi was hugely informative, and he really helped me a lot. I interviewed other people in that community. There's a museum in St. Lawrence that is dedicated specifically to the mining heritage there, which was really useful for that storyline, but also has a section of the museum dedicated to the Truxtun Pollux disaster. There's an incredible book by a writer in Newfoundland, passed away a number of years ago, Cassie Brown, who did a number of kind of populist takes on history, non-academic takes on Newfoundland history, specifically disasters. She did a great one on the sealing disaster of 1914 called Death on the Ice, and she wrote one about the Truxtun and Pollux disaster called Standing into Danger. And while it's a populist history, it's meant for general reading. It's not an academic book by any stretch. It's incredibly detailed and layered in its research. So the details of how that disaster happened, the mistakes that happened, how the events unfolded that night, and even right through the inquiry that happened afterwards are laid out in beautiful, very, very clear fashion in that book. So that was a huge help as well. And then the other side of it, of course, which was probably the most, besides writing about real people, the most terrifying aspect of writing about this story for me, because I came at it from the angle of this is a story that happened in Newfoundland and involves Newfoundlanders, was the fact that as a Caucasian Newfoundlander, I was going to be writing a story of racial subjugation of African Americans, which is so beyond my scope of knowledge, so beyond my scope of life experience. And so I was really, really afraid of appropriation of voice issues, really afraid of appropriation of story issues, and sought a lot of advice from other white writers who had written black storylines before on that front. So I did a lot of research surrounding that. There was a really great and, again, detailed book about the life of African Americans in the Navy in World War II called The Messman Chronicles. I forget who the author was. Again, so the specificity of detail, what comes out in terms of those two sailors talking to each other in the show, a lot of that detail is found in those books. Things like, they weren't allowed to sit down to eat, for example, right. That they would be called upon in the middle of the night before going to bed to go clean up a mess on the other side of the boat. And also a kind of, I guess, the attitude and the kind of, when racism like that is, the racism at that time was so systemic that it was pre-civil rights movement. It was so systemic that the interviews in the Messman Chronicles, when you read it, so many of those men, I don't want to use the word they were okay with it, but they would talk about the white sailors they served with, on this because they're tight quarters, The white sailors that they were serving with, they would talk about them with great affection and great respect. Oh, he was a wonderful man. He was a wonderful man. It's like, oh, you didn't want to cross him, or you couldn't sit. You couldn't. You had to be careful when you talked to him. Like, so it was so clear that there was a racial oppression there, but their view of it, having grown up within it, and it was so systemic, they wouldn't have called it that. It was fascinating. Right. So I tried to instill some of that in one of the characters as well.
I find that interesting that you say you were concerned about possibly appropriation of voices, and it's something that you're not familiar with. Could the story not have been told just from the moment he lands on the shore, and then it's really the story of that, as opposed to?
It could have been, but with all of these stories, I actually teach a little bit of playwriting now and then, and one of the workshops I do is about how to do this process. I guess what I've learned in the last 15 years of writing history. And part of that workshop and part of that teaching process is about identifying, I guess, methods of identifying the core of what the story is. And then once you identify it, kind of the climax of the play. Once you identify the climax of the play and the core of the story, then it's a process of working backwards to see what elements of the story bring you there, And without giving away too much to your listeners, there's a moment that happens in this play that for me, really all fingers point towards that in terms of that is the heart and soul and point of the play. And so it really became about, well, what do I have to lay in front of that to build towards that? And so certainly there is a play in here to be written that could be from the point of view of the Newfoundlanders, where Lanier plays a smaller role. But from my reading of the history and what spoke to me, this was a story of transformation. And it was a story of a transformation of this man. And so in order to be true to that, it required me to, hike up my courage and delve into areas that were a little scary for me to delve into politically, but also that were scary it was new territory for me to be writing voices that, because I've been writing Newfoundland voices for so long, to wander into a world where I was going to be trying to find an authentic voice from these people from the South.
I could see how that would be really intimidating, because I've written about the civil rights movement in this academic sense, and so obviously that's from a third-person perspective, sort of analyzing what happened.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to find their voice per se, right?
Yeah.
You have to find his voice.
Yes,
and
yeah.
Like who he really was, because that has to come across on stage.
Exactly, and and I relied, at a certain point, one of my colleagues, I got 2 pieces of advice from one of my colleagues, a white playwright in the country who had dealt with writing black stories before. And she said, do your research. Make sure that whatever you put in the play, you know the history behind it. Which I did at the time. Since now I look at the play and kind of go, I actually can't remember if that's something I made up or if it's actually true. And I keep going back to, no, I wouldn't have put it in if it's not true, but I can't tell you where I could tell you 3 years ago where that detail came from, but I'd have to do some digging now to find it again. So there's that aspect, and like know the material, so that if you're sitting around a table and someone questions you on that, you can go, well, this is where I found it and this is what it is. So there was that was one thing. And the other piece of advice she offered was let a lot of people read it, and particularly let a lot of people of color read it, whose history that is in some way a part of their history, and take their advice and engage with them and listen to them. And so I did that. I did a lot of that. So I relied really, really heavily on the actors who are currently in the show, but also previous actors, the musicians who are part of the music workshops of the piece, and people who've seen the show. We had a great friend of the show for a while in Chuck Smith, who had seen the piece. He eventually saw the piece in Toronto, but he had read the piece. Someone had sent him a copy of the piece, and Chuck is an African-American director based in Chicago. And so after he had seen the piece in Toronto, I sat down with him and I engaged with him. I was always concerned about this phrase and this turn of phrase. Is that right for the period? And so he helped me with a lot of that stuff. That doesn't take away the fear totally.
No.
But, it doesn't take away the fear totally. And I often do have to be really, really upfront about the fact that, and be very honest about the fact that I came to this story as a Newfoundlander because of Lanier's, without giving away too much, because of Lanier's particular experience with these Newfoundlanders. That moment, and for people who see the show, you'll know what the moment is. That moment speaks to, for me, an area and a quality of rural Newfoundland living of that time, my grandmother's generation and previous, that has so often got corrupted and mislabeled and made fun of as ignorance, stupidity, the vile Newfie joke, that Lanier's experience and how he speaks of it truly recontextualizes it into what it actually was, which was innocence, which was isolation, which was a sustenance-based living, where people had to leave school at kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, because usually with girls, they had siblings that they had to take care of. As soon as they were old enough to change diapers, they were their caregivers, because their mothers were out actually growing vegetables and tending to the fish. And with boys, they were out fishing with their father. And so that's an experience that I knew growing up as, a fisherman's grandson in Newfoundland, and seeing my dad have to drop out of high school because he was the third oldest of 12 children, to take care and go get a job and take care of his siblings when my grandfather got sick. And knowing that experience, and knowing my grandmother, and that my grandmother didn't have much of a school education, the experience between Lanier and Violet Pike specifically in the show, when I heard that story, I went, that's it. And Lanier got it. He was there for 2 days, and how he spoke about what had happened to him, he got something about that. Probably because there was probably a lot of parallels from where he came from as well. I mean, I can't imagine a lot of people of color in 1942 would have the opportunity to go through school and go on to college at that point in history. So he probably understood, looking at that lifestyle and looking at those people, there was probably a great communion there, and that's kind of the point of the show.
Right. Yeah, there is an innocence, and there's a clear difference between like innocence and like,
yeah,
or just like pure ignorance in a negative sense.
I think so. But it's it's fascinating. Chris Brooks, who I mentioned before, the radio documentary, when I started talking about writing this play, he had known this. He had known this story for many, many years, and it never got told in Newfoundland. It was kind of this shameful secret. And again, without getting too much into the details of what happens in the play, what happened between Lanier and Violet Pike specifically was, for many people, a shameful little secret that it was contextualized as ignorance. That only changed in 1987. Lanier came back to St. Lawrence for the first time. There was a kind of a come-home year organized around the 45th anniversary of the disaster. And Lanier and 20-something other survivors at that point. There were 46 men who survived that particular shipwreck, and 20 of them were still alive in the 80s. So they came back. And at the end of that weekend of celebrations, they had a kind of dinner. And at the end of the dinner, I heard the story firsthand from someone who was there. At the end of the dinner, they said, "Does anybody have anything else to say before we all part ways and go back home?" And this hand went up. And Lanier went up to the stage and said who he was and told the story that everyone knows, that everyone there knew about him and Violet Pike. And then he said what happened to him afterwards. And he talked about how that moment changed him. And nobody in that room knew that. This was this is 45 years later. Nobody in that room knew that this man had gone away. It was an anecdote. It was a foolish little, "Oh, Violet, why would you?" He had gone back to the United States completely changed, and so he stood there with tears in his eyes and said thank you for the first time after 45 years. At that point, I think the story started to be told more within Newfoundland, and it became a bit of a legend. To some people, even a bit of an urban legend. Did that really happen? Did that really happen? And it was only in the 90s that Lanier started coming back on a more regular basis. I think he's been back there. He was back about 7 times before he finally passed away 2 years ago. And it's kind of what I love about the story. Like it was this guy who had spent 2 days in Newfoundland, had this experience of 2 days in Newfoundland in 1942, that he recontextualized how my people saw that event. He recontextualized how my people saw ourselves, which that shakes me to the core. That's why I fell in love with the story, and that's why I wanted to tell it. And to jump back to the question you were talking about earlier, that's why all of that stuff about his great-grandmother being a slave and being owned, and what she taught him, the kind of fear and trepidation she taught him about white people, his experience on the boat, his experience with his daughter in Boston during the school race riots, why all of that stuff had to be in the show. And why, if I was going to be the writer, as I decided I was going to be the writer of the show, I had to get it together, I had to conquer my fear, and I had to dig in and do the necessary work. I mean, that work exists every time you dig into history anyway. Right. It's just in this case, there was that very, very big leap into a whole other cultural trajectory. And as a white man digging into a cultural history of historically oppressed people, that has its own has its own dynamic that you have to respect, and you have to be true to and respect.
And then I guess I could ask a question from the other side.
Sure.
Is that you have all this stuff about Lanier and his background, and yet there's also sort of this parallel track, at least through the first part of the play, where you see John and Levi in the mine. And why was that important to you to include to get to know these guys and their work in the mine? What do you think? What was sort of the motivation to add that?
Sure.
Because obviously you're a very proud Newfoundlander.
Yeah.
So you want to get to know these people.
Yes, that's true. You know. But when I originally started this play, the original conception of this play when I was doing the research, ironically, wasn't focused on the Newfoundlanders at all. It really wasn't. And in one very, very early... I didn't even get to the first draft with that idea. But when I first started to write, one very early conception as I was piecing together the first draft was that the first scene of the show... This didn't last very long. But the first scene of the show was going to be a kind of a mirror scene that we would see later in the show. That we would kind of see a kind of preview, and then we'd go into the story and then see this scene again later in the show. Okay. But the first scene was going to be Lanier on the beach, having made it to the beach, being covered in oil, almost died in the water, finally making it to shore, and these two white men running towards him and going, "We got him, get him, we got him." And that later in the show, that would be recontextualized to see what it actually was. But for Lanier in that moment, it was about a black man being taken by two white men. And in that conception, very, very early on, those white people were going to be a presence in the play, but a mysterious presence in the play. A presence in the play that was foreboding and scary, that would, of course, as events unfolded, become recontextualized to what they actually were. And so I started to go down that road. And then I realized that I had these characters in the show that were kind of placeholders. They were there, and I was asking them to be there and be mysterious until they were useful to Lanier's story. And that started to feel wrong. And so and you have to remember as well, like, this story, the history surrounding the story, I was completely in the dark about until I actually started this research. I didn't learn about this in school. I didn't learn about Lanier. Certainly I didn't learn about Lanier. I didn't learn about the Truxton and Pollux disaster. I didn't learn about St. Lawrence. I didn't know any of this stuff. That's important to what I'm going to say coming up. So when I went back and said, okay, well, maybe I should try to figure out who these people are. And so when I went back to try to figure out who these people are, sometimes it's like the story wants to be told, right? So when I went back to figure out who these people are, I discovered that this event happened in February 1942. I discovered that in September 1941, there's a fluorspar mine in St. Lawrence that had been open for about 10 years. That in September of 1941, there was a 3-month strike that ended at the fluorspar mine, where these guys have been striking all summer, attempting to get higher wages. But one of the things they'd actually asked for in that strike as well were for medical examiners to come in, because they felt they were getting sick. These men felt they were getting sick, and they were blaming it on the mine. The company, the fluorspar company, gave them a wage increase and essentially said, the wage increase, this is our offer, but we're not sending in doctors. It's not going to happen. And so the men, of course, feeding their families, they've all been on strike for 3 months, took the deal. Within 10 years of this disaster, pretty much half that town, the men in that town, were wiped out with silicosis, lung disease. I did not know this when I started to research oil and water. I did not know this. And so all of a sudden, trying to breathe life into someone like Violet Pike and trying to create a story for her whereby she is not a placeholder, not just a white face on stage to be fearful of, but that she actually has a story herself that affects and is affected by what happens with her and Lanier. All of a sudden, here she was, a woman who was watching with knowledge, because these men, remember, they asked for doctors. She was watching with knowledge as her husband was dying. And then I thought, okay, so now these white Newfoundlanders, these guys going down to the beach and pulling these men out of the oil, aren't just fishermen, aren't just miners. Now these guys are guys who think they might be dying. How does that change the story? And how does the story then evolve into a larger conversation, not just about race and racial harmony, which I believe the play is, but a larger conversation about personal choice and freedom? There's a lot of talk in the show about being at the bottom, being subjugated. In the case of Lanier, it was based on race. In the case of the Newfoundlanders, it was based upon economics. And how do those things come into play to tell a fuller story, so that it's not just about Lanier and the placeholders who are white being fearful, but that it's about a collection of characters who are all moving through similar circumstances, and that the play becomes about these disparate storylines coming together to the same core point at the end. Now, I make that sound really, really easy. I realized that halfway through the first draft, and then bang, it was there. I mean, 4 long years later, we still are working the story and still figuring it out. I think we've got it now. I think the core of how those things come together is finally working. But that's why I went down the road of telling that story. And it was fascinating to me. And here, sometimes when you do real work, stories based on real stories, the wildest things happen, right? So Violet Pike is a real person, and this incident happened with Lanier and Violet Pike. So then I knew I wanted to give Violet a life, so I said, okay, I'm going to give her a husband. So I went to the archives, found Violet Pike in St. Lawrence in the right year. She had a husband named John. I made him John. I needed to make one of these miners. It wasn't going to be Levi, because Levi was quite young and just starting in the mine. I needed to make one of these miners ill. to have silicosis. So John was my guy. He had to have that. And so I wrote, but as far as I knew, I didn't know anything about the real John Pike. He could have been a fisherman. He might not have even worked in the mine. So I gave him silicosis, and he ended up standing as a representative of all those men who got sick and died. Did the show. First time we did the show. And then the opening night, as I say, a lot of family members came. John and Violet had passed away a long time ago, but one of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren came to see the show and told the actor who was originally playing the part was Sean Panting, a different actor, told the actor that night that the grandfather, John, died of silicosis at age 41, which is Sean's exact age when he was playing the part.
Oh, wow. That
he was the oldest of 5 brothers. He was the one to last the longest, and the youngest brother had died at 25. And so in the story, there's all these, his brother dies in the mine, and all this kind of stuff. I believe one of the brothers had died in a mining accident as well. It was crazy. And so it actually, for all of my sets of reasons for making John that, that was my part of fudging history to make the show work to tell the grander story. You actually sometimes end up hitting on exactly how it was,
right?
Weirdly.
Do you get the sense too that it's, for as much as Lanier has changed, the people in St. Lawrence are changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. The thing that,
it goes because it seems to me that it really does go both ways.
Yeah.
And the perspective at which they're coming at the racial issues is completely different.
Yeah,
but everyone's sort of transformed in the process.
Everyone's transformed in the process, and that's exactly it. The thing with the Newfoundlanders getting transformed. And I said this. I was asked to talk. Weirdly, I was asked to talk a lot after Lanier passed away, because this show was kind of a big hit in St. John's, and so and had been recently a big hit. So it had just played the year before. So Lanier passed in March 2012, and so I immediately started getting asked for commentary on this because I had just written this big play about him, and so I composed a little thing that we post on our website and that I kind of sent out to the media and stuff about it. And what I said in that, and it's totally true, is that Lanier, and he never realized this, I told him this when we finally had dinner in 2012, and he was so humble, and I don't think he ever heard it. But he changed, he really didn't hear it, he really just wanted to talk about people from St. Lawrence. Everything was about, I'm just telling he would say, I'm just telling their story. They saved my life. They did everything. I'm doing nothing. I'm just telling people what they did. And what I said to him was, yes, but you changed the way those people saw themselves. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Up until 1987, that story was a source of shame. And he started talking about it, and it recontextualized the story to what it actually was. And it got people to look at that type of living, that isolation, that rural living, subsistence living, in a different way. And to accept, a lot of my ancestors in Newfoundland weren't highly educated, but it's because they were working really, really hard to survive.
Right.
And rather than that being a source of shame, as we now sit in our lovely, comfortable world where we can all go to university, we can go to trade school, and we can all buy cars and have internet, and rather than looking at it from that perspective, we need to look at what it was at that time. For me, that is an incredible source of pride, that my grandfather would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and by 10 o'clock that day have gone out and back 3 times collecting fish for his family. That's for his 12 children who lived in a house no bigger than my house in downtown St. John's that I live in by myself now. He raised 12 kids in that house. I think for a long time, Newfoundlanders, particularly as we joined Canada and as we started to become more integrated into Canadian and North American society, because it is an odd little place out there by itself, as we became more and more integrated, I think a lot of Newfoundlanders of my generation and my father's generation let that sit on us as a source of shame, as opposed to what it is, which is a really, really beautiful, courageous way of living that wasn't based upon educational models that we have now, but was based upon something completely different. Lanier did that for the people of St. Lawrence, I think. And I said that to him. I said, what you've given back to hear. And I don't think he fully understood, because he said, he was here for 2 days. He was in Newfoundland for 2 days and then went back to the States, right? So he didn't know, I don't think he knew anything about, for example, the history of that that when he was there in 1942, it was a country. He wasn't in Canada. It was a country.
Yeah.
And then that we lost, we gave up, whatever. We became part of Canada in 1949. That from that point on, there were 40 years of the nation of Canada getting to know us, the nation of Newfoundland being afraid to say who we were, you know, the propagation of the stereotype, the propagation of the drunk Newfoundland, or the propagation of the stupid Newfie, all that stuff that finally somewhere in the 70s and the 80s we started to push back against it a little bit. And I feel like we still are, but we only really conquered it in the last 10 years or so. Lanier didn't know any of that, right? So he was just telling his story. And so what I tried to impart to him at the dinner table that night, which I don't think I did a very good job at, because every time I talk about it I get so moved and upset, was that you gave us a tremendous thing. To hear a guy from the United States talk about us in a way that felt true, but also that we've rarely gotten spoken about from an outside perspective in that way. Right. Was hugely moving. That's why when Lanier, before his passing, when he'd go back to Newfoundland, he was a rock star there. Like, people would, you know, he showed up at that 70th anniversary thing. It was a church of 800 seats that was completely blocked, and there was lineups outside, and when they announced him to walk to the stage, people stood up and didn't applaud. They didn't applaud. They just stood up out of respect. Everyone stood up. He's like, people just love him there, and it's because he did that. So yeah, there is a transformation that happens. Lanier is also interesting enough because of that, you know, to demonstrate that sentiment towards him. He is one of the few people. Newfoundland Labrador has its own order, like the Order of Canada. We have the Order of Newfoundland Labrador, and he's one of the few non-Newfoundland born people. I think maybe the only one who's ever been inducted into that order. So yeah, he had a huge effect in the play. You know, because John is dying, and because Violet and John are. And there's no happy ending for that. I mean, there's no happy ending for the St. Lawrence Miners. A lot of them died. And there was no way in the play to try to make that a happy ending. It would have been disingenuous. Sure. So looking at that, how Lanier's story affects them is really about, there's a point made at the end of the show, that Lanier was one of 4 people of color on that boat. And he was the only one to dive into the water and try to make it to shore. The rest obeyed orders and stayed on the boat and essentially drowned. And Lanier swam for shore, and so he makes this point at the end of the story, if I'm going to die kicking. And that is hugely powerful for John and Violet to hear, because he is going to die, and they both know he's going to die. It's the quality of the life he's going to have left, and it's how he's going to approach that death, whether it's with dignity or with self-pity, and I believe he chooses dignity. Right.
Because it is a really good line in the show when he says that, if I'm going to die, at least I'm kicking. You touched on something that I want to ask. I think, I don't know what the theater community is like in Newfoundland. It's not something I'm overly familiar with. But my sense of living in central Canada for the majority of my life, and Saskatchewan for a couple of years, is that Newfoundland is only represented for the most part when it's used comedically.
It's true.
Right?
It's true.
Otherwise, things don't get set in Newfoundland. Newfoundland isn't referenced a lot. And so I'm just wondering if that's, like, as a Newfoundland playwright, you're bringing definitely a different version of what Newfoundland is compared to what normally gets represented in Canadian theater and television. I'm just wondering how much of a focus is that for you, and not just even in this show, but just in general in your work, to try and let people know that, you know, we're here, we're a real place. Like, I have a map. I studying Canadian broadcasting, so I have a map from 1931 that shows coverage of radio stations in Canada. Yeah. So it's the typical map of Canada, and you see the American coverage and Canadian coverage, and there's nothing over Newfoundland. Yeah, and I make a joke, and I say, well, you'll notice that there's nothing in Newfoundland, but they weren't part of the country yet, so we don't care about them. Right? And I say it as a joke. But there's part of it's true is, like, for 100 years, like, no one pays attention to Newfoundland. And so I'm just wondering if that's something
I was well out of university, and it still occasionally happens. I was well out of university, well into my adult years, and still hearing on national media right across Canada, from Halifax to Victoria. Any Newfoundlander has heard that phrase uttered on national media. right across this country, from Halifax to Victoria. One of the 10 provinces completely left out. So that is part of, I guess, the growing up a Newfoundlander. In the time we're in. Like I say, it's really about the country getting to know, because there's only 500,000 of us, right, in the province. I mean, they say there's another 1.5 million of us spread throughout Canada, but there's only 500,000 of us out there living in that province. So having 35 million people get to know 500,000 people is tricky. Mm-hmm. One way we've found that voice, and it always has been that way, the dark humor in Newfoundland is incredible. And the influence of people like Codco, I mean, Mary Walsh and Andy Jones and Kathy and all those guys, they were the first kind of theatrical voice of Newfoundland. And Chris Brooks, I talked about earlier, he ran a company called the Mummers Troupe that did highly, interestingly enough, never found a broader audience in terms of public airwaves because it was really, really contentious work. It was very political. They did some really, really early work on the seal hunt, for example, in the 70s, when stuff was really, really heating up with Greenpeace. Chris and his troupe were doing some really, really potent political theatre that people don't really know about now. I mean, theatre history in Canada will tell you that. Really important stuff. So those two trajectories in Newfoundland performing arts ran side by side. There's a huge streak of anger and political anger that a lot of theatre on the ground down there you will see manifested in, but that doesn't necessarily always have a life outside the province. And then the comedy of Codco, sharp, smart, dark comedy. That tradition found a life on the airwaves in Codco in 22 Minutes, Mary and Kathy and those guys moving on to that. Rick Mercer coming out of 22 Minutes, and then all of the 22 Minutes crowd now with Mark Critch and Shama Junder and Susan Kent and those guys. Johnny Harris, so that's a tremendously rich side of the culture. And there was a theatre review, I'll never forget this, there was a theatre review about 10 years ago. It was too recently, let's say that. It was too recently for someone to make this commentary. They were talking to the last 2 theatre critics at the Globe and Mail, and they were doing a review of Canadian theatre from coast to coast. And of course, most of it focused on Stratford and Shaw, and I get that. They're very important theatres. And then they spent the last 10 minutes talking about everything else outside of Ontario. Fine. Everyone outside of Ontario is very used to that. So that happens, and they talk about Vancouver, they talk about Calgary, they talk about great things happening in Calgary, wonderful companies, One Yellow Rabbit and Old Trouts and all that stuff. And then they got to Atlantic Canada, and they talked a little bit about Atlantic Canada in the last 30 seconds. And then one of them made a comment, in Newfoundland, all the theatre people went into TV comedy. Boom. Period. That was the end of the sentence. I just thought, that is such lazy journalism. Because like I said, there's an entire stream of writers like Janice Spence and Liz Picard and Frank Barry. These writers that, their work is funny, but that is not the point. There's dark political attack in that work. That hasn't had a life in the rest of the country, but is very, very valid there and very influential. And myself and Jill, will certainly be influenced by it. And so in terms of what I want to represent to the world and what I want to bring out to the world, I guess, and that's another reason why this whole thing at Lanier and how Lanier talks about Newfoundland really struck a chord with me, is that, yes, there's a kind of default that, even now, there's a default that in the theatre and in comedy in Newfoundland we often go to, which is what we term the rubber boot comedy. I don't know if that means anything to Central Canada, but, it's the rubber boot and the hair and... Heron rollers and like, oh yes, my dear, and the big thick Newfoundland accents, and that we go there and it's instantly laugh. It's recognizable to our people, like it's recognizable to people outside of Newfoundland, and so it's kind of an easy. I hope I'm not offending anyone who does that kind of work, but it's kind of an easy form of comedy. So we gravitate towards it all the time. And so with me, when I write Newfoundland characters, I don't try to stay away from that so much as I try to show another side to that. I really, really do consciously endeavor to write characters that have Newfoundland accents, that speak the way my parents and my grandparents speak, but that aren't necessarily always funny, that are true.
The real people.
that are real people to my experience. Yeah. And I think it's really, really important. I think it's really, really important for Newfoundlanders to see themselves on stage and kind of not feel like they have to default to that. Right. And I think it's really, really super important for people in the rest of Canada, North America, elsewhere, to see the culture of Newfoundland in its true light. Right. What they actually would see if they went and met people. Right. Funny, sharp-tongued, as John and Vala are in the show. Every second line is an insult, and they're jabbing each other, and it's dark, and it's funny. but in the heart, there's a trueness to them as well. They're real people.
But I wonder too. There was a couple times last night where there were lines that people in the audience laughed at that I don't think were intended to be funny. But they're coming out with a Newfoundland accent.
So give me an example of that. Do you remember?
It was. I think it was when the friend.
Ina?
Yeah. A couple of her lines as they're cleaning him up.
Yeah.
And there was a couple lines, and I can't remember the specific lines, but
sure.
I thought, like, this is supposed to be a really poignant moment, and it gets there, but there was a couple times where people, and it wasn't like the whole audience. There was like smatters of laughter. I'm like, I don't think that was meant to be.
I don't think funny. We have long since abandoned this notion that. And I mean, not just with this show, but like a long time ago, abandoned any sense of what an audience should do, or what an audience reaction should be. And so what it comes down to for us, and it's really interesting to talk to the actor who plays that part, Alison Woolridge, because every now and then someone will come up to her and say, "Oh, you're the comic relief, you're so funny." And it makes her kind of bristle. Like she's very funny in the show, but Alison's intent is to be true. And so there's a moment in the show, without giving too much away, there's a moment in the show where the actors sing this beautiful hymn, and it's right towards the end of the show, and they're dressing Lanier. They're kind of, he's just landed on shore and they're putting his clothes on, and they have to dress him. And so Jill was working this out with Patrina and Alison, how they would dress this man. And Alison, was like, we have to put his, because he's just been through this traumatic event, he can barely move, I had to put his underwear on. And so they're trying to figure out, well, what would a Newfoundland woman do if she had to put an underwear on, like a very modest society, very religious? What would they do if they had to put underwear on this man, this young man that they just met? And so Alison started to play, truthfully, the trepidation of that, the kind of embarrassment of that. And it's very funny. It's very, very funny. But it's also very, very true. If it wasn't true, we wouldn't have done it.
Right.
And when it first started to happen, I started to get laughs back in 2011 when we first did it. I started to bristle myself and go, no, but there's something kind of gorgeous of that true, funny moment sitting alongside this gorgeous hymn and what has just followed and what's happening for Lanier in that moment. It's a really complex, emotionally complex moment in the show.
And that tends to be your first reaction when you don't know what to do emotionally. You laugh. And I think people need relief. Like at that point in the show, people want the relief and they want to... When there's a lot of tension.
Yeah. If the laughter felt dismissive, if it felt like people in that moment were laughing and dismissing the importance of what this means to Lanier or the kind of beauty of this guy who up until 3 minutes before in the play was absolutely terrified of white people. Everything in his life was said, he just 3 minutes previous to that in the show was going, "Let me go, don't hurt me." Yeah. And is now being tenderly dressed by these two women. If the laughter erased that, we'd have to do something. But I don't feel it does. But yes, I think your point is valid. I think, some of the lines that Ina has in there are made funnier by the fact that it's coming from a Newfoundland audience, from a Newfoundland voice, but I kind of forgive that at the same time too. Like I used to, as a younger, angrier man, I had wishes of how Newfoundland would be viewed by the rest of the Canada, and I would get my back up a little bit when it wasn't, and I'd kind of blame people that how can you, and I kind of relax, like. As a place, we do have a history of comedy, and we do have a history, if you want to call it education. We do have a history of how we've educated the rest of the country of who we are, has come from, in broad media, has come from a place of comedy. So, I as a Newfoundlander, I cannot blame someone from Whitehorse if they meet me as a Newfoundlander and then find my accent funny. I can't blame them for that because that's their only exposure to it has been through comedy all the time. Right. So I've started to cool down a little bit and relax about that. And understand that, okay, well, I can cool down and relax about that, but I can still make my work about trying to educate that person in Whitehorse about the full scope of what that accent is and what that, Because even I'm 42, so I graduated university in the 90s, and even when I was going to university in the 90s, there was a part of me that, can I actually admit this on the radio? I'll admit it. There was a part of me that was ashamed of my accent, and that I would come to the mainland of Canada, and I would feel, I'd get in a cab, and someone would say, "Where you're from," And I just, I'm from St. John's, Newfoundland, and sometimes they'd laugh and they'd, what are you up by? And they'd do that kind of stuff, and it just made me so uncomfortable, and part of me wanted to rid myself of my accent, and I think part of that is still, as Lanier says in the show, part of that is still in me. Part of that is still in me insofar as if I'm here chatting with you, my accent is nowhere near as thick as if my mom called me on my cell now and I started chatting with her. The accent would come out, and I can't even fake it. If I tried to fake it right now, it would sound fake. But I think that's true of a lot of my generation of Newfoundlanders. And so then seeing someone like Mary and Andy and Rick, these guys who, I'm so honored, growing up having watched these guys on TV, I'm so honored now to be able to call them my friends and colleagues. But seeing people like that, and Alan Hawko, who's a good friend of mine, Republic of Doyle, seeing these guys on TV and that accent coming out of them, and actually being able to listen to it and hear the beauty in it, and kind of go, that's my accent. That's it's a huge gift that those people, the comedy aside and the great work they do, that's a huge gift for making that accent, to my ears anyway, beautiful and romantic. And so I've completely rolled over. How did I get talking about an accent? I don't even know how I got there. But yeah.
It's one of the interesting dynamics of the show, I think, is having these characters play serious moments in a Newfoundland accent, which is something you just don't see very often. Yeah. At least I haven't seen it very often. So
it's fascinating, isn't it? I think that's true. I mean, to your credit, it's funny because we're talking about history, but to your credit, I've never talked about this in an interview before, either on this show or either on Oil and Water or Tempting Providence, which has been touring for 12 years. I've never had that conversation. I've always suspected it. I've always suspected it's true that audiences, seeing Tempting Providence, because Tempting Providence is toured everywhere. Oil and Water is just starting to, and hopefully it will keep going, but Tempting Providence has played across the country multiple times. And I've done a lot of interviews about that show, and I've never actually spoken to anyone about that. And I've always suspected it to be true, that this is the first time. There's a scene in Tempting Providence where a woman, she's lost a child to TB, and again, it's a product of the time. There was no medical education at that time. She just doesn't understand or get it, that it's contractable. So the nurse comes to her house and is talking to her about, you need to be careful because your child died of TB. You might have it. I want to check. And this woman is grieving. She's just lost a child, and she basically tells the nurse to get out. And she has this really heavy monologue about burying her child and standing with her husband and watching her child go in the ground. Really heavy stuff, said in an incredibly thick Western Newfoundland accent. That's never funny, and people never laugh at it. Right. I mean, it happens halfway through the show, so by that point I think people get that they're not necessarily watching a comedy. But I think that's fascinating. It's probably, for a lot of Canadian audiences, I would imagine, the first time they've heard that accent utilized, like you say, in a way that's not comedic. Right. Certainly the work of, I'm not sitting here and saying, I'm the first person to do, certainly the work of someone like David French, who was born in Newfoundland, David French has played Saltwater Moon, they've been done all over the place, and oftentimes done with good, actors who can handle that Newfoundland accent, which is tricky. Whether they're from Newfoundland or not, it's a tricky accent to do. So I'm in no way am I sitting here and saying that, I'm the first person to do this, but I think it's a rare thing. It's much more common for people to experience the accent through the large medium of television, through Codco and This Hour and those kind of things.
So the show is running through May 31st. I don't want to wrap up, but we've taken way more time. We're in someo's office, and we've taken a lot more time than we told he would.
Talking.
So he's probably up there waiting, I have work to do. So the show runs at the National Arts Center through May 31st. And you said you're in discussions right now to take it elsewhere.
We are. I mean, there's always, it's a big show. I don't know how much people know about touring theater in Canada. Probably not. Outside of the industry, I don't know how much of that is known. But it's a big show. A lot of the shows that tour in Canada, most of them, I would say, are smaller. This piece has 10 actors, so there's 16 people on the road that travel with this show. It's an expensive proposition. And even though when you look at the kind of aesthetic of the show on stage, we call it minimalist. I mean, there's a lot of props and costumes and sets. So it's a big show to tour. We're always in discussion with people who are interested, and then trying to make that the reality, funding-wise and scheduling-wise. But the desire is certainly there on our part, and I think on the part, which is really encouraging, on the part of the actors and the people who work on the show. I think there's nothing more gratifying to me as a creator on this piece to see that after 3 years of touring this thing, these incredible artists who could be working anywhere with the skill set they have, that they remain committed and want to keep working on the show with each other is hugely gratifying. I could cry talking about it. So hopefully we'll see it have a longer life.
Okay, and if people want to sort of find some of your other work, we talked before. You have a Wikipedia page, which is the main marker, the main marker of success.
In
2014. But otherwise,
you can check out my company website, which is www.artisticfraud.com.
Okay.
And so there's information there a little information on me, certainly on Jill Kiley, who that's the company that she started. And
it's a great name.
Thanks.
Great
brought her
name.
to prominence, and of course, got her the job at the National Arts Center. Her work that she did through that company, and you can find out some of the stuff about what we're doing coming up, the other shows that we're in development. Particular of interest to your history-based people. Yep. Our next piece is an adaptation I did of a very famous Newfoundland novel called The Colony of Unrequited Dreams by Wayne Johnston. Wayne Johnston is kind of one of the country's great historical fiction writers, and this book from 1997 is a fictional history of Joseph R. Smallwood and Newfoundland joining Confederation of Canada. Okay. It's a massive, sweeping, epic monster of a play that we're doing next February.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so hopefully Ottawa will see that at some point.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. We like Joey Smallwood here. He's a fun character.
He's a great character. Yeah. He's an amazing character. Yeah. Very controversial, a very divisive character in Newfoundland history, but unparalleled importance, of course, to our history and what happened to us.
Yeah. So I would encourage everybody to check it out. And you're also, I forgot to mention this at the top, you won the Governor General's Award for English Language Drama.
That's why I have a Wikipedia page. That's the only reason.
It still counts.
No, it still counts.
Doesn't matter how you get there.
It counts. It certainly counts. It's certainly a high point winning that award. That was amazing. I'm very proud of that one.
Well, I appreciate you doing that, or being here and doing the show, and congratulations on the show and the success that it's had so far. So that's Robert Chafe, the playwright of Oil and Water, again, at the NAC through May 31st. And check out artisticfraud.com for any information on future productions. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, it's historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is at Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.